The Cold War never exploded into open battle. But what if it had? What if the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union turned into World War III? For nearly 50 years, the world lived in fear of nuclear war. From Berlin to Cuba, humanity stood only minutes away from disaster. So what if that thin line of restraint had snapped? The Cold War began right after World War II. The US and the USSR were allies against Nazi Germany. But once the war ended in 1945, mistrust grew quickly. The US promoted democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union pushed communism and state control. By 1949, the Soviets had tested their first nuclear bomb. The arms race began. By the 1960s, both sides had thousands of warheads, each one capable of wiping out entire cities. This fragile balance was called mutually assured destruction. If one side fired, both sides would be destroyed. But what if someone pulled the trigger first? The closest the world ever came to nuclear war was 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the US and USSR faced off. President John F. Kennedy demanded removal. Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused. In reality, both sides backed down. But what if they hadn't? What if a US jet was shot down and Kennedy retaliated? What if Khrushchev ordered a strike? Experts estimate the first exchange would have killed 80 million people within hours, and that was only the beginning. If the Cold War turned hot, the bombs would fall fast. Major targets: Washington, Moscow, London, Berlin, Beijing. Cities reduced to ash in seconds. But the deadliest weapon wouldn't just be the explosions. It would be the smoke. Scientists predict a nuclear winter. Smoke and ash would block sunlight for months. Crops would fail. Temperatures could drop by 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Billions might starve. Even if they survived the bombs, would humanity ever recover? If war broke out, Europe would be the battlefield. The US and NATO stationed millions of troops in West Germany. The Soviet Union had the Warsaw Pact armies in the east. The front line ran through Berlin. One push could spark total invasion. Conventional fighting might start with tanks and planes, but as one side began to lose, nuclear weapons would be unleashed. Cities like Paris, Warsaw, and Frankfurt would vanish. Could Europe survive as the center of Armageddon? The Cold War wasn't only about the US and USSR. Other nations would be dragged in. China had nuclear weapons by the 1960s. India tested in 1974. Pakistan followed in 1998. If the Cold War turned hot, Asia would explode. Korea and Vietnam could see nuclear strikes. Japan, an ally of the US, might be targeted again. Would entire civilizations disappear in one war? Suppose humanity survived the first months. What then? Governments destroyed, economies collapsed, communication gone, nations reduced to ruins. Survivors might live underground. Barter would replace money. Nuclear radiation would poison land and water. Would society rebuild or return to the Stone Age? So why did the Cold War stay cold? Because leaders feared the cost of war. Kennedy and Khrushchev chose diplomacy in 1962. Reagan and Gorbachev later signed arms reduction treaties. Both sides understood no one could win a nuclear war. Fear itself kept peace. If the Cold War turned hot, the world we know wouldn't exist. Instead of smartphones and space travel, we might live in ruins. Instead of cities, there might be ash and silence. But history chose a different path. The Cold War ended without a single nuclear bomb fired in anger. Humanity survived. So here's the final thought. The greatest victory of the Cold War was not in battles. It was in the war that never happened.